A desperate knock on a freezing winter night brought a bleeding cowboy and a dying child to a penniless widow's door. She gave them her last scrap of food and firewood, never suspecting the rugged drifter was actually a millionaire tycoon whose deadly secret would soon turn her world upside down. The wind howling through the San Juan Mountains of Colorado in the winter of 1888 was merciless. It tore through the cracks in the dilapidated timber cabin of Abigail Mercer, a woman whose life had been stripped down to its barest bones since the tragic death of her husband, Arthur. In a mining accident 2 years prior, Abigail had been left with nothing but a mountain of debt, 50 acres of rocky, unforgiving land, and a pervasive, aching loneliness. On this particular evening, the blizzard was blinding. The snow piled up against the windows in thick, icy drifts. Abigail sat by the dying embers of her hearth, wrapping a frayed woolen shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. She had exactly 3 logs of firewood left, half a sack of flour, and a jar of preserved peaches. Survival was no longer a certainty. It was a daily, grueling negotiation with death. She was just about to close her eyes when a sound cut through the screaming wind. It was a heavy, desperate thud against the heavy oak of her front door. Abigail froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Out here, miles from the nearest settlement of Durango, a knock in the middle of a blizzard meant one of 2 things: a neighbor facing a life-threatening emergency, or trouble. With trembling hands, she reached for Arthur's old Winchester rifle resting above the mantel. She checked the chamber, 1 bullet left, and crept toward the door. "Who goes there?" she shouted, her voice barely carrying over the gale. "Please!" A rough, breathless voice called back. "My boy. He's freezing." The mention of a child shattered her hesitation. Abigail threw the heavy iron bolt and yanked the door open. The storm immediately invaded the cabin, bringing a blast of white snow and biting cold. Framed in the doorway was a towering silhouette of a man. He wore a snow-caked Stetson and a heavy leather duster. But it was what he carried in his arms that made Abigail drop her rifle. Wrapped tightly inside a thick, wool blanket was a small boy, no older than 5. Before Abigail could speak, the man took a stumbling step inside. As the warm light of the cabin hit him, she saw the alarming amount of blood soaking through the right shoulder of his coat. His face was pale, his jaw set in a tight grimace of agony. His eyes, a piercing shade of steel blue, met hers for only a fraction of a second before his knees buckled. "Help him!" the man rasped, collapsing onto the wooden floorboards with a heavy thud, shielding the child from the impact with his own body. "Lord Almighty!" Abigail gasped, rushing forward to slam the door shut against the blizzard. She dropped to her knees beside the strangers. The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. She carefully peeled the blanket back to reveal the little boy. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue, his skin like ice. But he was breathing. Abigail knew she had to act fast. She didn't think about her meager supplies or how she would survive the rest of the week. She threw her last 3 logs onto the dying fire, coaxing the flames back to roaring life. She filled her only cast-iron pot with snow and set it over the fire to melt for water. With immense effort, she dragged the heavy, unconscious man closer to the hearth, resting him on a rag rug. She then scooped up the freezing child, stripped him of his damp, icy clothing, and wrapped him in her own heavy quilts, holding him close to the fire, rubbing his small limbs to stimulate the blood flow. "Come on, little one," she whispered, her voice cracking. Stay with me." After an agonizing hour, the boy's eyelids fluttered. He let out a soft, whimpering cough, and the terrifying blue tint began to fade from his lips. Relief washed over Abigail in a warm wave. She settled the boy on her only bed, piling every blanket she owned on top of him, before turning her attention to the man. Carefully, she cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. A deep, ugly gash tore across his right shoulder, a gunshot wound. The bullet had passed clean through, but he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Abigail retrieved her sewing kit and a bottle of strong, cheap whiskey Arthur had left behind. She cleaned the wound, ignoring the way the man flinched and groaned in his delirium, and bound it tightly with strips torn from her only clean petticoat. As she worked, she studied him. He had the rugged, weathered face of a cowboy, with days-old stubble and a strong, square jaw. Yet, there was something odd about him. When she removed his boots to warm his feet, she noticed the leather, though scuffed and muddy, was of a quality she had never seen in Durango. And while his hands were strong, the calluses were not the thick, hardened horn of a man who swung a pickaxe or roped cattle for a meager daily wage. Dawn broke, painting the snow-covered valley in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The storm had finally passed. The man stirred, letting out a sharp hiss of pain as he tried to sit up. "Don't move," Abigail commanded gently, stepping into his line of sight, holding a steaming tin cup of broth made from the last of her dried meat. "You'll tear the stitches." He blinked, his steel-blue eyes focusing on her. He looked around the cramped, poverty-stricken cabin, his gaze finally resting on the bed where his son was sleeping peacefully. A profound look of relief crossed his hardened features. "Samuel," he breathed. He's safe," Abigail assured him, pressing the warm cup into his good hand. "His fever broke an hour ago. He just needs rest. Drink this. You lost a lot of blood." The man took the cup, taking a slow sip. He looked back up at Abigail, taking in her patched, faded dress and the obvious hunger hollowed into her cheeks. He saw the empty woodbox and the bare shelves. He knew instantly that this woman had sacrificed everything she had to save them. "I owe you my son's life," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'm Harry Cole." "Abigail Mercer," she replied, offering a weary but genuine smile. "And you don't owe me anything. Mr. Cole, out here. We help those in need. What happened to you?" Harry's eyes darkened, a flash of something dangerous and calculating crossing his face before it was smoothed away into the weary expression of a drifter. "Rustlers," he lied smoothly. "Caught us on the trail, took our horses, and left us for dead. If we hadn't seen the smoke from your chimney—" He trailed off, looking deeply into her eyes. Abigail felt a strange flutter in her chest. There was an intense gravity to this man, a quiet power that seemed entirely out of place for a down-on-his-luck cowboy. "Well, you're safe now," she said softly. "Rest. You're not going anywhere for a few days." As Abigail turned away to check on little Samuel, Harrison Sterling, known in the high society parlors of Denver and Chicago as one of the most ruthless and wealthy railroad tycoons of the West, leaned back against the floorboards. He had been ambushed, not by rustlers, but by hired guns working for a rival syndicate trying to halt his railroad expansion. They had thought him an easy target while traveling incognito with his son. Harrison watched the penniless widow move about her freezing cabin. He was a man who possessed millions of dollars, vast cattle ranches, and politicians in his pocket. Yet in his darkest hour, none of his wealth had saved him. It was the desperate charity of a destitute widow that had pulled him and his son from the brink of death. He made a silent vow right then and there. He would repay her. But first, he had to figure out how to survive the week without his enemies finding him. Over the next 4 days, a delicate domestic rhythm settled over the isolated cabin. The heavy snowpack kept them entirely cut off from Durango, trapping the 3 of them in a world of their own. Little Samuel bounced back with the resilience only a 5-year-old possesses. He was a bright, remarkably polite child who took to following Abigail around the cabin, helping her sort dried beans and listening wide-eyed to her stories of the mountain lions and eagles that roamed the peaks. Abigail, whose heart had been locked away since her husband's death, found herself melting at the boy's laughter. Harry, despite Abigail's strict orders to rest, refused to be a burden. Though he favored his right arm, he managed to repair the hinges on her broken woodshed door, patch a leaking hole in the roof with scrap tin, and trap a pair of snowshoe hares to replenish their dwindling food supply. Every evening, they sat by the fire. Harry proved to be a man of few words about his past, but he was an excellent listener. He learned of Arthur's death in the silver mines, and of the crushing debt left behind. He borrowed against the land. Abigail confessed one night, the firelight dancing across her tired features. She was mending one of Samuel's torn socks. $500 from a local land baron named Thaddeus Boone. Thaddeus has been buying up all the struggling homesteads in the valley. Our land has the only year-round freshwater creek for miles. He wants it, and he knows I can't pay the note. Harry's jaw tightened. When is the note due? End of the month, Abigail said, a tremor of despair in her voice. I don't know what I'll do. Harry, I have nowhere else to go. Harrison felt a familiar, cold fury rising in his chest. In his world, men like Thaddeus Boone were bottom feeders, petty tyrants who preyed on the weak. Harrison destroyed men like Boone before breakfast. He could write a draft right now that would buy the entire town of Durango 10 times over. But he couldn't. If he revealed his true identity as Harrison Sterling, he would expose himself to the assassins who were surely still scouring the territory for him. Worse, he would paint a target on Abigail's back. She would go from being a penniless widow to an accomplice of a railroad magnate. He needed to handle this carefully. Don't you worry about Boone, Harry said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous, absolute certainty. You saved my boy. I'll make sure you don't lose this land. Abigail looked at him, touched by his bravado, but ultimately dismissing it as the empty promise of a poor cowboy. Thank you, Harry. But Boone isn't a man you can just chase off with a harsh word. The opportunity to test that theory arrived far sooner than either of them expected. On the 5th day, the sun finally broke through the clouds, beginning to melt the snowdrifts. Around noon, the sound of heavy hooves sloshing through the melting snow reached the cabin. Abigail looked out the window and went pale. It's him! It's Boone! Harry stood up instantly, his hand instinctively going to his hip, though his gun belt was hanging by the door. Stay behind me, he ordered. Thaddeus Boone was a stout, red-faced man wearing a beaver fur coat and a bowler hat that looked ridiculous in the rugged wilderness. He was flanked by 3 heavily armed hired men, their hands resting lazily on the grips of their revolvers. Boone didn't even bother knocking. He kicked the front door open and strode into the cabin as if he already owned it. Well, Widow Mercer, Boone sneered, his eyes darting around the meager room before landing on Harry. Boone paused, sizing up the tall, formidable man standing protectively in front of Abigail. "I see you've taken in a stray, and a crippled one at that." "Get out of my house, Thaddeus," Abigail said, her voice shaking slightly but holding its ground. Boone chuckled, pulling a folded piece of parchment from his coat pocket. "I don't think so. I've come to do you a favor. Abigail, the weather's breaking. I know you don't have the $500, but I'm a generous man. Sign the deed over to me today, and I'll forgive the debt and give you $20 for a stagecoach ticket out of the territory." "The note isn't due until the end of the month," Abigail protested. "I'm calling it in early." Boone lied smoothly. "Times are tough. I need the capital. Sign the paper, or my men will throw your belongings into the snow right now." Before Abigail could respond, Harry stepped forward. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The relaxed, helpful cowboy was suddenly gone, replaced by a man radiating an aura of absolute authority and menace. It was the same look Harrison Sterling used to bring rival tycoons to their knees in the boardrooms of Chicago. "The lady told you to get out," Harry said, his voice deadly quiet. Boone puffed out his chest, though he took an involuntary step back. "Who the hell are you? Drifter. This is business between the widow and me. You step in, and my boys will put you in the ground next to her husband." The three hired guns tensed, but Harry didn't even blink. He took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Boone. "My name is Harry," he said softly, his steel blue eyes locking onto Boone's. "And I know a fraudulent early call when I see one. You have no legal standing to seize this property before the 30th of the month. If your men lay a hand on her property today, the territorial marshals will hang you for armed robbery, not debt collection. Now, you have exactly 10 seconds to get off this porch before I take that paper and shove it down your throat." Boone stared, visibly unnerved. This drifter didn't speak like a cowboy. He spoke with the clipped, precise cadence of an educated, powerful man. The hired guns looked to Boone for orders, but Boone's nerve had broken. "Fine," Boone spat, backing out the door. "You want to play lawyer, drifter? You have until Friday next week. If I don't have my $500 in gold by high noon on Friday, the sheriff himself will come drag you off this property." Boone and his men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving the muddy snow torn up in their wake. Abigail collapsed into a wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. "Friday," she sobbed. "It's impossible. I have nothing left to sell." Harry crouched beside her, gently pulling her hands away from her face. He looked at her tear-streaked cheeks, feeling a profound pull in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the beautiful, fiercely resilient woman before him. "Abigail, look at me," he commanded softly. She met his eyes. "I gave you my word. You are not going to lose this home." "How?" she cried softly. "You're just one man, Harry, a cowboy who's just as broke as I am." Harry offered a small, mysterious smile, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You'd be surprised what a broken-down cowboy can do." That night, after Abigail and Samuel had gone to sleep, Harry sat by the fire, writing a coded message on the back of a torn label from the peach jar. He needed to get a telegraph to Denver. He needed his fixers, his money, and his private security force. But to send the wire, he had to ride into Durango straight into the open, where the men who tried to kill him might be waiting. He was risking his life, and potentially his multi-million-dollar empire. But as he looked toward the bedroom where the poor widow slept, Harrison Sterling knew he would burn his entire railroad to the ground before he let anyone harm her. Long before the sun crowned the San Juan Mountains on Tuesday morning, Harry slipped out of the cabin. He saddled Barnaby, Abigail's aging, sway-backed draft horse, and began the grueling trek into Durango. His wounded shoulder screamed with every jolt of the trail, but the grim determination etched into his jaw never wavered. Durango in 1888 was a bustling, muddy boom town fueled by the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. It was also crawling with danger. As Harry hitched Barnaby outside the local saloon, he pulled his Stetson low over his eyes. Standing near the boardwalk, smoking cheap cigars, were two men wearing long canvas dusters. Harry recognized them instantly. They weren't common rustlers. They were hired guns on the payroll of Jay Gould, a ruthless rival railroad baron who had sworn to see Harrison Sterling's empire crumble and Sterling himself dead. Gould's men were actively showing a sketch to the local sheriff. They were hunting him. Harry kept to the alleyways, his boots sinking into the freezing mud, until he reached the back entrance of the telegraph office. He slipped inside, startling the young, bespectacled operator. "I need to send a wire," Harry rasped, tossing a silver dollar onto the desk, a coin he had found hidden in his boot lining. "Priority. To Denver." The operator grabbed his pad. "Who is the recipient?" "Mr. James McParland," Harry said softly, invoking the name of the legendary superintendent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency's Western Division. McParland was on Sterling's personal payroll, handling the tycoon's most sensitive security matters. "The message is as follows: Eagle grounded in Durango. Cargo safe. Need 500 gold and heavy escort by Friday noon. Coordinates to follow." The operator's eyes widened. Anyone out west knew the name McParland, and standard cowboys didn't send coded messages asking for private armies. But the silver dollar was persuasive. The operator tapped out the Morse code, the frantic clicking echoing in the small room. Suddenly, the front door of the office rattled. Through the frosty glass, Harry saw the silhouettes of Gould's two dust-covered hounds. They had seen him slip into the alley. "Out the back," Harry hissed to the operator. As the front door kicked open, Harry threw his weight against a heavy oak filing cabinet, toppling it into the gunman's path. A gunshot roared in the confined space, the bullet shattering the telegraph machine into flying shrapnel. Harry didn't hesitate. He vaulted through the back window, the glass shattering around him, and hit the muddy alley rolling. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the tearing pain in his stitched shoulder. He untied Barnaby with his good hand and spurred the old horse into a chaotic gallop down the back alleys of Durango, losing Gould's men in the maze of slaughterhouses and lumber yards. He had sent the wire, but as he rode the long, agonizing miles back to the cabin, a dark dread settled in his stomach. The blizzard had wiped out miles of tracks north of the town. Even with Pinkerton's unmatched resources, getting an armored train or stagecoach from Denver to this remote valley by Friday noon was nearly impossible. When Harry finally stumbled back into the cabin that night, covered in mud and shivering violently, Abigail was terrified. She tended to his bleeding shoulder again, her gentle hands working by the firelight. "You shouldn't have gone," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Boone will take the land. Harry, it's just dirt. I can't let you get killed over it." Harry reached up, his rough, calloused fingers catching her tear. "It's not just dirt. Abigail, it's your home. And I protect what is mine." The words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken promise that made Abigail's breath catch. For the next 3 days, they waited. The tension in the cabin was a physical weight. But beneath it, a quiet, profound bond was solidifying between the millionaire hiding in plain sight, and the widow who had saved his life. Friday morning dawned crisp, clear, and agonizingly cold. By 11 o'clock, Abigail had packed her few belongings into 2 battered leather trunks. Samuel was sitting on the bed, clutching a carved wooden horse Harry had whittled for him, his wide eyes sensing the impending doom. Harry stood by the window, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the empty, snow-glaring horizon. At 11:45, the sound of approaching horses broke the valley's silence. Thaddeus Boone rode into the clearing, looking far more confident than he had days prior. This time, he hadn't just brought hired guns, he had brought Sheriff Miller, a man well known to be residing comfortably in Boone's deep pockets. "Time's up, widow," Boone shouted, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Bring out the money, or bring out your bags." Abigail closed her eyes, letting out a defeated breath. She moved toward the door, but Harry blocked her path. He unbolted the heavy wood and stepped out onto the porch, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "You're a long way from jurisdiction, Sheriff," Harry called out. Sheriff Miller spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "I'm here to enforce a legal eviction. Drifter. Boone here says the note is due, unless you have $500 in gold hiding in those rags of yours. You're trespassing." "You have no right," Abigail cried out, stepping onto the porch behind Harry. "It's robbery," Boone sneered, dismounting his horse. "It's business, my dear. Now, boys, clear them out." The hired guns moved forward. Harry's hand hovered over the revolver tucked into his belt. He was out of time. He prepared to draw, knowing he would likely die on this porch, but determined to take Boone with him. "What?" The piercing, earth-shaking scream of a steam whistle echoed through the valley, stopping every man dead in his tracks. Boone frowned, looking toward the distant tree line. "The tracks are miles from here, not the spur line," Harry said softly, a slow, dangerous smile finally spreading across his face. Bursting through the snowy pines, rumbling along a forgotten, overgrown logging track that bordered Abigail's property, was a massive, gleaming black locomotive. It wasn't a standard passenger train. It was heavily armored, billowing thick black smoke, and bearing the golden insignia of the Sterling Transcontinental Syndicate. The train screeched to a halt at the edge of the property. Before the steam had even cleared, the doors of the private carriage slammed open. Out stepped half a dozen men wearing immaculate suits and bowler hats, carrying repeating rifles. Leading them was a sharp-eyed, sharply dressed man clutching a heavy, iron-bound lockbox. It was James McParland. Boone and his men watched in stunned silence as McParland marched through the snow, flanked by Pinkerton agents, straight toward the porch. "Mr. Sterling, sir," McParland said, coming to a halt and offering a deep, respectful nod. "My apologies for the delay. The snowdrifts at Wolf Creek Pass required dynamite." "You're right on time, James," Harry replied, his voice shedding the rough cowboy drawl and taking on the crisp, commanding resonance of a tycoon. Abigail stared at him, her jaw entirely slack. "Mr. Sterling, Harry, what is going on?" Harry turned to her, his eyes softening. "My real name is Harrison Sterling. Abigail, I own the railroad that just pulled into your backyard." He turned back to the trembling land baron. "Mr. Boone, you requested $500. McParland stepped forward, opened the heavy iron box, and dumped a cascading pile of solid gold eagles directly into the snow at Boone's boots. It was easily 10 times the requested amount, "There is your 500, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The rest is to purchase every single acre of land you own in this territory. You will sign the deeds over to Mrs. Mercer today, or Mr. McParland here will begin looking into the forged land claims and bribed officials that fund your little empire. I hear the federal penitentiary is quite cold this time of year." Boone's face drained of all color. He looked at the heavily armed Pinkertons, then at the gold, and finally at the man he now realized was one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. Without a word, Boone dropped to his knees in the snow and began frantically scooping up the gold. "Sheriff," Harrison barked, "escort this trash out of my sight. If I ever see him in Colorado again, I will buy this county just to fire you." Sheriff Miller practically scrambled onto his horse, herding Boone and his men away as fast as they could ride. The silence that fell over the cabin was profound. Harrison turned to Abigail. She looked overwhelmed, staring at the extravagant train, the armed guards, and the man who had slept on her floor for a week. You lied to me," she breathed. "I hid the truth to keep you safe from the men hunting me," Harrison corrected gently, stepping closer. "Abigail, my money, my power, none of it mattered when I was bleeding to death in a blizzard. You saved me. You saved Samuel. You gave us everything you had when you had nothing." He reached out, taking her trembling hands in his. "I am a man who builds empires, Abigail, but standing in this cabin, I realized I have no home. Come with me to Denver. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to repay the debt of my heart." Abigail looked toward the door, where little Samuel was standing, smiling brightly at her. She looked back at Harrison, seeing past the billionaire to the rugged, devoted man who had fixed her roof and protected her fiercely. A warm, brilliant smile broke across her face as she squeezed his hands. "You don't owe me a debt, Harrison Sterling," she whispered softly. "But I think I'd like to see Denver." If this incredible true story of a widow's kindness and a millionaire's secret touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life Wild West tales. What would you have done in Abigail's shoes? Let us know in the comments below, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload.